Japanese admirals mocked it as slow and clumsy. Then this single aircraft helped send their greatest warships, Hiyō, Musashi, and Yamato, to the bottom. In the early months of 1942, as the Pacific War expanded with stunning speed, officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy reviewed reports of a new American torpedo bomber entering service. The aircraft was designated TBF Avenger. On paper, it looked unimpressive. It was large, heavy, and slower than many frontline fighters. Its silhouette lacked elegance. To Japanese eyes, trained to admire sleek lines and agility, it appeared clumsy, even outdated. Japanese naval aviation had been built on a very specific belief system. Aircraft were expected to strike first, strike fast, and not be hit at all. Speed was survival. Light construction was a virtue, not a weakness. Pilots were elite warriors, not expendable operators inside machines designed to absorb damage. Within this worldview, the Avenger made little sense. Compared to Japan's own Nakajima B-5N Kate, the American aircraft looked bloated. The Kate was lighter, faster, and had already proven itself devastating at Pearl Harbor. It fit perfectly into Japanese doctrine: deliver a precise blow, then disappear before defenses could respond. The Avenger, by contrast, seemed to accept that it would be shot at and planned to endure it. That assumption alone was enough for many Japanese officers to dismiss it. When intelligence photographs circulated through naval planning offices, the reaction was muted. Some officers reportedly joked about the aircraft's size. Others questioned why the Americans would burden a torpedo bomber with armor and multiple crewmen. In Japanese doctrine, additional weight meant reduced performance. Reduced performance meant death. There was no sense of urgency, no alarm, no serious reassessment. Then came Midway. In June 1942, the TBF Avenger entered combat for the first time. A small detachment launched from Midway Atoll against the Japanese carrier force. The result was catastrophic. Of the 6 Avengers sent into battle, 5 were shot down. The lone survivor returned riddled with holes, barely flyable, its crew badly wounded. To Japanese observers, this engagement confirmed everything they already believed. The Avenger was slow. It was vulnerable. It could not survive against experienced fighter opposition. If anything, the losses at Midway reinforced the idea that American torpedo aviation remained inferior to Japan's own. What Japanese planners did not fully grasp was how differently the Americans interpreted the same event. For the U.S. Navy, Midway was not proof that the Avenger was a failure. It was proof that it was unfinished. The aircraft had reached the target. It had pressed the attack under overwhelming fire, and one machine, damaged beyond any reasonable expectation, had still made it back. That detail mattered. The Avenger that limped home from Midway was not celebrated as a victory. It was studied. Engineers examined every hole in its fuselage, every severed cable, every system that had failed, and every one that had not. The lesson was clear. This aircraft had survived conditions that would have destroyed lighter designs outright. Japanese officers, meanwhile, moved on. Their focus remained on decisive fleet engagements, on perfect execution, and on the belief that technological superiority lay in refinement rather than resilience. They had little reason, in mid-1942, to imagine that the Avenger would ever pose a strategic threat. After all, the war still appeared to favor Japan. Carriers were intact. Veteran pilots dominated the skies. The enemy seemed reactive, not adaptive. But beneath the surface, a fundamental difference was already taking shape. The Avenger was not designed to be admired. It was designed to be used, repeatedly, relentlessly, and at scale. Its creators assumed losses would occur and built the aircraft accordingly. Armor plating protected the crew. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire risk. Redundant systems allowed damaged aircraft to remain controllable. It was, from the beginning, an aircraft built for a long war. Japan did not believe in long wars. Imperial doctrine emphasized the single decisive moment, the climactic battle that would break the enemy's will. In such a framework, survivability beyond the first engagement was almost irrelevant. Either the war would be won quickly, or it would not be won at all. That belief shaped everything from aircraft design to pilot training. The Avenger belonged to a different philosophy entirely. It was a product of industrial warfare, where victory came not from perfection, but from persistence. It did not need to be better than every enemy aircraft. It only needed to keep coming back. In 1942, Japanese officers could not yet see that distinction. To them, the Avenger was just another American experiment, awkward, inefficient, and destined to be swept aside by superior skill and experience. They laughed because the aircraft did not match their expectations of what a weapon of war should look like. They would not laugh again. By the time the Avenger revealed its true purpose, the balance of the Pacific War would already be shifting. And the cost of that early dismissal would be measured not in aircraft lost, but in ships sunk and fleets broken. Welcome to WWII Forgotten Fronts, a channel dedicated to the untold battles, the overlooked heroes, and the hidden machines that shaped the Second World War. Here we dive beyond the famous headlines to uncover stories buried in diaries, lost archives, and forgotten frontlines. If you're passionate about deep storytelling, real wartime experiences, and cinematic history, you've just found your new home. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Now, let's step into the past. Midway should have been a warning. Instead, it became a reassurance. From the Japanese perspective, the brief encounter with the TBF Avenger during the battle seemed decisive. 5 aircraft destroyed, 1 barely escaping. The score appeared lopsided, almost trivial. Japanese after-action assessments focused on what they had always valued: fighter interception, pilot skill, and defensive firepower. In those categories, the Imperial Navy still appeared dominant. The Avenger was written off as another example of American haste. A new aircraft rushed into combat before it was ready, crewed by inexperienced airmen, sent into a hopeless attack. That narrative fit neatly into existing assumptions, and so it went unchallenged. But the truth was more dangerous. The Avengers that attacked at Midway were not part of a mature system. They lacked proper fighter escort. Their torpedoes were unreliable. Their crews were green. In Japanese doctrine, such a failure would have ended the story. A flawed weapon was discarded, a failed tactic abandoned. The Americans did the opposite. At Pearl Harbor and Midway, the U.S. Navy had learned something painful but essential. Naval air power could not rely on brilliance alone. It required coordination, redundancy, and above all, survivability. The Avenger was not judged by how many aircraft were lost, but by what information could be extracted from those losses. The single Avenger that returned from Midway became the center of intense scrutiny. Engineers and tacticians reconstructed the mission second by second. They mapped where the aircraft had been hit, which systems failed first, which design choices had saved the crew's lives. The conclusion was unsettling and promising. The Avenger had taken punishment far beyond what its designers had initially calculated. The airframe had flexed, but not failed. Control surfaces remained partially responsive even after severe damage. Fuel tanks resisted catastrophic ignition. The crew survived not because of luck, but because the aircraft had been designed to accept damage as a given. This was not how Japanese aircraft were conceived. Imperial Japanese Navy planes were masterpieces of weight reduction. Armor was stripped away. Self-sealing tanks were sacrificed for range and maneuverability. The assumption was simple. If you were hit, you had already failed. Survival was the pilot's responsibility, not the machine's. That assumption worked, until it didn't. At Midway, Japanese torpedo bombers suffered devastating losses of their own. But Japanese assessments framed those losses differently. They were blamed on circumstance, on timing, on misfortune, rarely on design philosophy. The idea that aircraft themselves could be made more survivable at the cost of some performance did not gain traction. The Americans, meanwhile, doubled down. Midway convinced U.S. planners that torpedo bombers would always face overwhelming fire. The solution was not to make them faster than bullets, but tougher than expectations. The Avenger became the centerpiece of this thinking. Its production accelerated. Its design was refined. Its crews trained under the assumption that missions would be contested, chaotic, and deadly. Japanese intelligence failed to track this evolution. Reports continued to describe the Avenger as slow, heavy, easy prey for fighters. And in isolation, those reports were not wrong. An Avenger without escort, flying straight and level, was vulnerable. But war does not reward isolated truths. It rewards systems. What Japan did not see after Midway was the emergence of a new American method of naval warfare, one in which aircraft were not expected to win alone. Fighters, bombers, radar, logistics, and industrial output were being integrated into a single operational organism. Midway marked the first appearance of the Avenger. It did not mark its arrival. As 1942 gave way to 1943, the aircraft began appearing in larger numbers. Carrier decks filled with Avengers instead of older, lighter designs. Training programs standardized crew coordination. Torpedo tactics were rewritten, emphasizing timing and mass rather than individual heroics. Japanese commanders still believed they understood the threat. They assumed that if they could maintain air superiority, any torpedo bombers, would remain secondary. They believed the decisive factor was still the duel between elite pilots. Aircraft like the Avenger were seen as supporting actors, not the main weapon. This misreading was subtle, but fatal. The Avenger was never meant to dominate the sky. It was meant to dominate the sea beneath it. Midway had shown the Japanese Navy that American torpedo aviation could be destroyed. What it failed to show them was that destruction no longer carried the same meaning for the United States. Losses were no longer endpoints. They were data points. By drawing the wrong conclusion from Midway, Japanese officers missed the early signs of a transformation. They believed they had judged the Avenger at its weakest and found it wanting. In reality, they had only seen it before it learned how to fight. And as the war moved into its second year, that learning curve would begin to intersect with Japanese capital ships in ways no one in Tokyo had anticipated. To understand why Japanese officers misjudged the TBF Avenger, it is necessary to understand what kind of war its designers believed they were fighting. The Avenger was not conceived as a weapon of finesse. It was conceived as a weapon of endurance. From its earliest design stages, the aircraft reflected a grim assumption. Torpedo bombers would always be shot at. They would always fly into dense anti-aircraft fire. They would always be targeted by fighters first. Survival was not an accident. It had to be engineered. The Avenger's size, which Japanese observers saw as a liability, was in fact a requirement. The aircraft needed internal space to carry a full-size torpedo without external drag. It needed room for armor plating around the cockpit and vital systems. It needed structural strength to absorb damage without catastrophic failure. Its Wright R2600 engine was chosen not for elegance, but for reliability and power under load. The Avenger was expected to take off from carrier decks with heavy payloads, fly long distances over open ocean, and still have enough reserve power to return after battle damage. This was not a fighter mentality. It was a transport-like mentality applied to a combat aircraft. Equally important was the Avenger's crew configuration. Unlike many Japanese torpedo bombers, which relied heavily on the pilot's individual skill, the Avenger distributed responsibility across 3 men. The pilot flew and attacked. The turret gunner defended the upper hemisphere. The radio man gunner monitored the rear and maintained communication. This was not redundancy for comfort. It was redundancy for survival. Japanese doctrine emphasized the warrior pilot, the single aviator whose judgment and reflexes decided everything. American doctrine assumed that even skilled pilots could be overwhelmed, disoriented, or wounded. Tasks were divided so that no single failure would end the mission outright. The Avenger's defensive armament reflected this thinking. The powered dorsal turret, a feature Japanese officers found particularly unnecessary, allowed the aircraft to actively defend itself against pursuing fighters. It did not make the Avenger invincible, but it changed the cost of attacking one. Japanese pilots would later report that Avengers did not behave like other bombers. They did not immediately break formation. They did not dive away at the first hit. They often held course longer than expected, forcing interceptors to remain exposed to defensive fire and escorting fighters. This behavior was not bravery. It was design. The Avenger was also built to operate as part of a system. Its avionics, radio equipment, and later radar integrations were designed to connect it to a wider tactical picture. Torpedo attacks were no longer individual charges. They were timed components of coordinated strikes. This was another critical point Japanese planners underestimated. Imperial doctrine prized precision and timing, but it relied heavily on visual coordination and pre-planned execution. American doctrine increasingly relied on real-time information, radar contacts, vectoring, and dynamic retasking. The Avenger fit seamlessly into this evolving framework. Even its weaknesses were accepted deliberately. The Avenger was not fast. Its maneuverability was limited. But these traits were tolerated because speed alone no longer defined survivability. Escort fighters, suppression of enemy air defenses, and massed attacks were becoming more important than individual performance. Japanese aircraft design had reached a peak before the war. Refinement had squeezed out every possible advantage of weight and speed. But that left little room for adaptation. Adding armor or self-sealing tanks would have required fundamental redesigns Japan could not afford, either in time or resources. The Avenger, by contrast, had been designed with growth in mind. Later variants incorporated improved armament, better electronics, and refined damage control features. It became more lethal without abandoning its original purpose. That purpose was simple: get the torpedo to the target. Japanese officers initially viewed torpedo bombers as fragile tools meant to exploit brief windows of opportunity. The Avenger redefined them as persistent weapons, capable of repeated strikes under increasingly hostile conditions. By late 1942, American carriers were no longer fielding torpedo squadrons as expendable assets. They were building strike packages around them. The Avenger was no longer an experiment. It was becoming doctrine. Japan did not yet recognize this shift. Their assessments continued to focus on aircraft-to-aircraft comparisons: speed, climb rate, turning radius. In those metrics, the Avenger rarely impressed. But those metrics were becoming less relevant with each passing month. The real battlefield was changing. Airspace was becoming crowded, defenses layered, engagements extended over hours instead of minutes. In that environment, survivability, coordination, and logistical depth mattered more than elegance. The Avenger had been built for that future. By the time Japanese pilots began encountering massed Avenger formations, supported by fighters and guided by radar, the opportunity to counter its philosophy had already passed. The aircraft they once laughed at was now doing exactly what it had been designed to do: endure long enough to strike back. And the sea lanes of the Pacific would soon bear the consequences. By 1943, the growing effectiveness of the TBF Avenger was no longer just a question of aircraft design. It was a reflection of two fundamentally different ways of fighting a war. The Avenger belonged to a system. Imperial Japan relied on doctrine. Before the war, Japanese naval aviation had been shaped by a single guiding idea: the decisive battle. Victory would come from one overwhelming engagement in which superior training, spirit, and timing would shatter the enemy fleet. Everything else, logistics, attrition, replacement, was secondary. This belief had worked before. At Tsushima in 1905, Japan had destroyed a larger Russian fleet through preparation and precision. That victory became doctrine. It influenced generations of planners who believed that wars were won by moments, not processes. American planners believed the opposite. The United States entered the Pacific War assuming it would be long, costly, and industrial. The enemy was distant. Supply lines were vast. Losses were inevitable. Victory would not come from a single perfect strike, but from sustained pressure applied across time. These opposing assumptions shaped everything. Japanese aircraft, including torpedo bombers, were designed to maximize performance in the opening phase of battle. They were fast, light, and deadly, ideal for a first blow. But they were also fragile. Once losses mounted, there was little margin for recovery. The Avenger, by contrast, was never meant to be decisive in isolation. It was designed to function inside a broader operational machine, one that included radar, carrier task forces, standardized training, and industrial replacement. This difference became clearer as the war progressed. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual excellence. Pilots were trained intensively, but slowly. Skill was cultivated over years. Once trained, pilots were expected to be irreplaceable assets. This produced elite aviators, but also meant that losses were catastrophic. American doctrine emphasized standardization. Pilots were trained to a high baseline, not an elite peak. Procedures were documented. Tactics were shared. Crews rotated. Experience was institutionalized rather than personal. The Avenger thrived in this environment. Its crew-based design mirrored American thinking. If one man was wounded, another could compensate. If an aircraft was lost, another would replace it. The system absorbed damage and continued functioning. Japanese systems could not. As losses mounted in 1942 and early 1943, Japan faced an impossible choice: reduce training standards to replace pilots faster, or preserve quality and accept shrinking numbers. Either path led to decline. The Americans did not face this dilemma. Their industrial base allowed them to expand training while improving aircraft. The Avenger's production increased even as its capabilities improved. New squadrons formed faster than Japan could replace veterans. Doctrine also shaped how each side reacted to change. When American torpedo attacks failed early in the war, the response was adaptation. Torpedo depth problems were investigated. Attack profiles were rewritten. Escort coordination improved. Failures became lessons. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, resisted change. Torpedo bombers were expected to perform as they always had. When circumstances changed, improved American defenses, better fighter coverage, the doctrine did not evolve quickly enough. The Avenger was not just an aircraft Japan underestimated. It was a signal of a larger shift Japan did not fully comprehend. By mid-1943, American carrier groups no longer sought decisive single encounters. They conducted rolling operations, raids, strikes, withdrawals, and re-engagements. Each operation degraded Japanese strength incrementally. In this environment, an aircraft like the Avenger was ideal. It could fly long distances, survive partial damage, and return to fight again days later. Its value compounded over time. Japanese planners still searched for a decisive moment that would reverse the war. They believed that if they could destroy enough American carriers at once, the strategic balance could be restored. That belief led them to conserve forces, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The Avenger undermined that strategy. It forced Japan to defend constantly. Every carrier movement risked attack. Every resupply effort faced attrition. There was no single battle to prepare for, only continuous pressure. By the time Japanese officers began acknowledging that American torpedo bombers were no longer fragile, the war had already shifted into a phase their doctrine was not designed to survive. The Avenger did not defeat Japanese naval aviation alone, but it exposed the weakness of a system built for a different kind of war. One side fought for moments, the other fought for inevitability, and inevitability favors systems that endure. By the middle of 1943, the Pacific War had entered a phase neither side had fully anticipated at its outset. The rapid advances, dramatic carrier clashes, and decisive first blows of 1941 and 1942 were gone. In their place came a slower, grinding contest defined by attrition, logistics, and sustained pressure. It was in this environment that survival, once a secondary consideration, became decisive. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this shift was deeply unsettling. Japanese air power had been built to win quickly. Aircraft were optimized for range and agility, pilots for individual excellence. But as the war dragged on, those advantages began to erode. Veteran pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages reduced training hours. New pilots arrived at the front with only a fraction of the experience their predecessors had possessed. Each loss now mattered more than the last. The Americans experienced the opposite trajectory. By 1943, U.S. carrier air groups were larger, better coordinated, and increasingly confident. Radar-directed interceptions improved fleet defense. Fighter escorts became standard rather than exceptional. Most importantly, aircraft were no longer treated as single-use tools. They were expected to return, be repaired, and fly again. The TBF Avenger was central to this transition. Early in the war, torpedo bombers had suffered some of the highest casualty rates of any aircraft type. Low-altitude attack profiles exposed them to intense anti-aircraft fire. In 1942, many planners questioned whether torpedo attacks were even viable against modern fleets. The Avenger answered that question not by avoiding danger, but by enduring it. In 1943, American tactics evolved rapidly. Avengers no longer attacked in isolated straight-line runs. They approached from multiple bearings, timed to coincide with dive bomber strikes that forced ships to maneuver. Fighter escorts suppressed enemy interceptors. Anti-aircraft fire was saturated rather than avoided. Under these conditions, survivability became the decisive factor. Avengers were hit, often repeatedly, but they increasingly returned. Crews learned how much punishment their aircraft could take. Pilots held their runs longer. Torpedoes were released closer to optimal range. The probability of a hit increased with each adaptation. Japanese gunners began to notice something disturbing. Aircraft that should have broken off did not. Bombers that appeared mortally damaged stayed airborne. Torpedo bombers continued their attack runs even after taking direct hits. The psychological effect was profound. Defensive fire no longer guaranteed safety. Japanese fighters, meanwhile, were being asked to do more with less. Reduced fuel quality limited performance. Pilot fatigue increased. Encounters with American escort fighters became more frequent and more dangerous. In this environment, the Avenger's defensive turret and rear guns mattered more than raw speed. Attacking an Avenger was no longer a simple intercept. It required time, exposure, and coordination, resources Japan increasingly lacked. Survival began to shape outcomes in subtler ways as well. Each Avenger that returned carried more than a crew, it carried experience. Crews debriefed, shared lessons, refined tactics. Knowledge accumulated at the squadron level, then spread across the fleet. Mistakes were analyzed systematically. Japanese air units struggled to replicate this process. Losses disrupted continuity. Experienced leaders were killed. Replacement crews lacked mentors. Tactical knowledge fractured instead of accumulating. By late 1943, American torpedo squadrons were no longer learning how to survive. They were learning how to optimize destruction. The Avenger's range allowed it to strike targets previously considered secure. Its payload options expanded beyond torpedoes to include bombs and depth charges, increasing flexibility. It became a multi-role platform capable of adapting to changing mission demands. Japanese doctrine had not anticipated this versatility. Torpedo bombers were supposed to be specialized weapons used at decisive moments. The Avenger was becoming a workhorse, flying strike missions, patrols, anti-submarine operations, and reconnaissance. It was present everywhere, all the time. This omnipresence created constant pressure. Japanese ships could no longer assume safety outside of major battles. Every movement risked detection. Every operation faced attrition. Even when no ships were sunk, damage accumulated. Crews were exhausted. Repair capacity was stretched thin. The Avenger was not delivering dramatic victories yet, but it was eroding Japan's ability to sustain war at sea. In 1943, survival stopped being an abstract concept. It became measurable. It meant returning with damaged wings, landing hard on carrier decks, repair crews working through the night to make aircraft flyable by morning. The Avenger excelled at this kind of war. Japan's early dismissal of the aircraft had been based on a snapshot, how it performed once under unfavorable conditions. By 1943, that snapshot had become irrelevant. The Avenger was no longer a new weapon. It was a mature one, refined by combat and supported by a system designed to keep it in the fight. And as survival began to matter more than elegance, the balance of naval air power shifted decisively. The first true shock to Japanese confidence was approaching. It would come not in theory, but in flame and sinking steel. The first moment of real disbelief came in June 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By then, Japanese naval leaders understood that the war was going badly, but they still believed in limits. Certain ships, they assumed, could absorb punishment. Certain weapons, they believed, remained secondary threats. The aircraft carrier Hiyo was one of those assumptions. Converted from a passenger liner, Hiyo was not as heavily protected as Japan's fleet carriers, but she was still a formidable vessel. Her air group was experienced. Her anti-aircraft defenses had been reinforced. To Japanese planners, she was not supposed to fall to torpedo bombers operating at the edge of American carrier range. But that is exactly what happened. On June 20, 1944, as the battle reached its chaotic climax, American carrier groups launched long-range strikes against retreating Japanese forces. These were not opportunistic attacks. They were calculated risks, pushing aircraft and crews to their operational limits. TBF Avengers formed a critical part of these strike packages. Flying hundreds of miles from their carriers, often low on fuel, Avenger crews pressed forward. Many aircraft would not return. That was understood. What mattered was reaching the target. Japanese fighter cover was thinner than expected. Fuel shortages and earlier losses had taken their toll. Anti-aircraft fire remained intense, but coordination was uneven. For the first time, American torpedo bombers approached in numbers that overwhelmed localized defenses. Avengers descended toward Hiyo from multiple angles. Torpedoes entered the water in disciplined patterns. They were no longer scattered, hopeful shots. They were aimed, timed, and synchronized. One torpedo struck near the starboard engine room. Another detonated near aviation fuel storage. The explosions were immediate and catastrophic. Fire spread rapidly through the ship. Damage control teams fought desperately, but ruptured fuel lines fed the flames. Internal explosions followed. Within hours, Hiyo was doomed. When the carrier sank, taking hundreds of sailors with her, Japanese officers struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed. This was not a lucky hit. It was not a single aircraft slipping through defenses. It was a method. Reports filtered upward through the chain of command, and a pattern began to emerge. The attackers were not elite dive bombers or experimental weapons. They were torpedo bombers, large, slow, and previously underestimated. The Avenger had delivered the killing blows. For years, Japanese naval doctrine had treated torpedo bombers as fragile instruments, useful only under ideal conditions. Hiyō proved that assumption wrong in the most brutal way possible. Under coordinated attack, survivable torpedo bombers could cripple capital ships with frightening efficiency. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese gunners had believed that volume of fire could always break up low-level attacks. But Avengers continued their runs through flak. Some were hit, some burned. Yet enough survived to release their torpedoes. Fighter pilots reported difficulty stopping the attacks in time. Engaging Avengers meant prolonged exposure to escorting fighters and defensive fire. Every second spent on a torpedo bomber was a second not spent defending the fleet as a whole. For the first time, Japanese officers began questioning earlier conclusions. Why were these aircraft still attacking after being hit? Why were they appearing in greater numbers instead of fewer? Why were losses not reducing American pressure? The answers were uncomfortable. Hiyō's loss demonstrated that the Avenger was no longer an auxiliary weapon. It was a fleet killer when used correctly. More importantly, it revealed that American naval aviation had reached a level of coordination Japan could not easily counter. The carrier's destruction was also a signal of strategic imbalance. American commanders were willing to trade aircraft for ships. They understood that aircraft could be replaced quickly. Ships could not. Japan's industrial reality made the opposite trade catastrophic. Each sunken carrier narrowed Japan's operational options. Each successful Avenger attack reduced the margin for error. There was no longer room for doctrine built on perfection. Hiyō was the first major carrier to fall to Avenger-led attacks. But she would not be the last Japanese capital ship undone by this aircraft. After June 1944, the tone of Japanese assessments changed subtly. Dismissal gave way to concern. Mockery was replaced by unease. The Avenger was no longer laughed at, but it was still not fully understood. That misunderstanding would persist just long enough to seal the fate of ships far larger, far more famous, and far more heavily armored. The shock of Hiyō was only the beginning. After the sinking of Hiyō, something subtle but irreversible changed inside the Imperial Japanese Navy. The confidence that had once surrounded air defense, the belief that skill, speed, and firepower could always stop incoming attackers, began to erode. Not publicly, not officially, but quietly in combat reports and pilot debriefings that no longer sounded certain. For years, Japanese fighter pilots had considered torpedo bombers easy prey. They were slow, predictable, forced to fly straight and low during attack runs. In training, such aircraft were treated as textbook targets. Intercept, fire, break away. The Avenger broke that pattern. By mid-1944, Japanese pilots were encountering Avengers that behaved differently. They flew in tighter formations. They approached under escort. They pressed their attacks even after taking hits that should have forced disengagement. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they did not panic. Fighter pilots reported that Avengers often held their course longer than expected. Some continued toward their targets, trailing smoke, wings damaged, control surfaces partially shot away. Others released torpedoes at dangerously close range, maximizing hit probability at the cost of survival. This was not recklessness, it was calculation. The Avenger's design allowed crews to gamble with damage. Armor protected vital areas. Redundant systems kept the aircraft controllable. Even when the odds turned against them, crews knew they still had a chance to complete the mission, and sometimes to return. Japanese aircraft offered no such reassurance. As losses mounted, Japanese pilots became more cautious. Every engagement carried greater personal risk. Fuel shortages limited time in combat. Ammunition supplies were inconsistent. Replacement aircraft often lacked the performance of earlier models. In this environment, attacking an Avenger was no longer a low-risk maneuver. The dorsal turret forced fighters into less favorable attack angles. Rear gunners watched blind spots carefully. Escorting American fighters hovered nearby, ready to pounce on interceptors that lingered too long. Engaging one Avenger often meant exposing oneself to several threats at once. The myth that torpedo bombers could be casually swept aside collapsed under this reality. Japanese commanders began to notice a troubling trend. Defensive success no longer translated into strategic safety. Even when several Avengers were shot down, others still reached their targets. Attrition was no longer symmetrical. American squadrons replaced lost aircraft quickly. Crews rotated. Tactics evolved. Japanese units, by contrast, grew thinner with each engagement. Experience drained away. Survivors carried heavier burdens. The Avenger amplified this imbalance. Because it could absorb damage and still function, it increased the cost of defense. Ships expended more ammunition. Fighters burned more fuel. Crews endured longer periods at high alert. Fatigue accumulated. Over time, this constant pressure wore down Japanese naval aviation more effectively than any single battle. The psychological impact extended beyond the cockpit. Ship commanders who once trusted in air defense began to doubt it. Anti-aircraft gunners fired earlier and longer, often wasting ammunition. Confusion increased during coordinated attacks. Defensive discipline weakened under stress. The Avenger did not need to sink a ship every time it attacked. It only needed to undermine confidence. By late 1944, Japanese intelligence reports reflected this shift. Avengers were no longer described dismissively. They were labeled durable, persistent, and increasingly dangerous. But recognition came without solutions. Japan lacked the fuel to train pilots for prolonged interception battles. It lacked the radar coverage to detect strikes early. It lacked the industrial base to redesign aircraft around survivability. The Avenger, meanwhile, continued to improve. Crews refined approach angles. Strike leaders coordinated timing with ruthless precision. Losses were accepted, analyzed, and compensated for. What had once been seen as an easy kill had become a grinding threat. The collapse of this myth marked a turning point. Japanese officers now understood that the Avenger could not be dismissed tactically. But the deeper realization that it represented an entirely different way of fighting was still incomplete. That final understanding would come not in the skies over a carrier group, but over the hull of one of the most powerful battleships ever built. And when it did, it would leave no room for doubt. In October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy committed one of its most powerful symbols to battle. The battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, displaced over 70,000 tons when fully loaded and carried armor so thick that many believed it was effectively immune to air attack. She represented the ultimate expression of pre-war naval thinking, overwhelming strength concentrated into a single, decisive weapon. For Japanese planners, Musashi was not just a ship, she was reassurance made steel. On October 24, 1944, in the Sibuyan Sea, that reassurance began to unravel. American carrier aircraft detected Musashi as part of the Japanese center force moving toward Leyte Gulf. What followed was not a single dramatic strike, but a relentless sequence of attacks spread across hours. Avengers were central to this assault. Wave after wave approached. Some aircraft were shot down. Others were damaged. But enough survived to attack again and again. Torpedoes struck Musashi below the armor belt, exactly where battleships were most vulnerable. The first hits caused flooding. The second set worsened it. Each subsequent strike compounded the damage. Japanese damage control teams fought with discipline and courage, counter-flooding compartments and struggling to maintain stability. But the Avenger's strength lay in persistence. Torpedoes did not need to penetrate Musashi's thick side armor to be effective. They needed only to rupture hull seams, jam rudders, and disrupt internal systems. The Avenger crews understood this. Attacks were coordinated to target the same side of the ship, gradually inducing a list. As Musashi slowed, she became easier to hit. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was ferocious. The sky around the battleship filled with black bursts and tracer fire. Yet Avengers continued to approach. Some released torpedoes at dangerously close range, maximizing impact even as their aircraft took damage. This was not a duel between equals. It was a war of systems. Musashi represented peak craftsmanship, but she could only be built once or twice. Avengers were built by the hundreds. When one fell, another took its place. When one crew was lost, another trained crew replaced it. The psychological toll on Musashi's defenders was immense. Each successful hit reduced speed and maneuverability. Each near miss reminded them that the attacks would not stop. There was no decisive moment, only accumulation. By the afternoon, Musashi had taken multiple torpedo hits and bomb strikes. Her list worsened, counter-flooding reached its limits, steering became unreliable. When she finally capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 sailors with her, the message was unmistakable. A single battleship, no matter how powerful, could not withstand sustained, coordinated air attack. For Japanese officers observing the reports, Musashi's loss was more than a tactical defeat. It was the collapse of an entire belief system. The idea that armor and firepower could guarantee survival in modern naval warfare had been disproven, methodically, publicly, and irreversibly. The Avenger had not delivered the killing blow alone. Dive bombers and fighters played their roles. But it was the torpedo hits, many delivered by Avengers, that made survival mathematically impossible. This was the final refutation of the early dismissal. The aircraft once mocked for its size and speed had helped destroy one of the most powerful warships ever built. Not through brilliance or luck, but through relentless application of pressure. Musashi's sinking demonstrated what Japanese doctrine could no longer deny. The future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft that could survive long enough to strike repeatedly, supported by systems designed for endurance rather than perfection. And if Musashi could fall this way, there was only one question left. What would happen when her sister ships sailed into the same storm? By April 1945, there were no illusions left, only obligations. The Imperial Japanese Navy no longer believed it could win the war, but it still believed it must fight. From that contradiction came Operation Tengo, a mission defined less by strategy than by symbolism. The battleship Yamato was ordered to sail. She was the largest battleship ever built, the final embodiment of an idea Japan had pursued for decades, that decisive surface power could shape the fate of nations. Yamato carried guns larger than any mounted at sea, armor thicker than any adversary could easily penetrate, and a crew trained to defend her to the last. But she sailed with critical weaknesses. Air cover was inadequate. Fuel was limited. The mission itself was effectively one way. Yamato was expected to reach Okinawa, beach herself if necessary, and fight until destroyed. American intelligence detected the sortie almost immediately. Carrier task forces moved into position, and once again, TBF Avengers formed a central component of the response. This was not an improvisation. It was doctrine refined through years of combat. The lessons of Hiyo and Musashi were now operational knowledge. The attack began on April 7, 1945. Avengers approached in organized waves, supported by fighters and dive bombers. Their objectives were precise. They did not aim to penetrate Yamato's main armor belt. They aimed to cripple her ability to maneuver. Steering gear, propulsion, stability. Torpedoes struck the port side repeatedly. This was not accidental. American strike leaders understood that inducing a list would overwhelm Yamato's damage control capacity. Counterflooding could compensate only so much. Once the balance tipped too far, recovery would become impossible. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense, but by now it was insufficient. Fire control was strained. Coordination broke down under the scale and timing of the assault. Avengers pressed their runs through flak, releasing torpedoes at close range. Some aircraft were lost. Many were damaged. Enough survived. As hits accumulated, Yamato slowed. Her list increased. Internal flooding spread beyond containment. Attempts to counterflood only worsened other vulnerabilities. The ship became increasingly helpless, a massive target in open water. The final explosion came when internal magazines detonated. The blast tore the ship apart, sending a column of smoke thousands of meters into the air. Yamato disappeared beneath the surface within minutes. With her sank more than 3,000 sailors. For Japanese officers receiving the reports, the meaning was unmistakable. Yamato had not been defeated by another battleship. She had not been outgunned. She had been dismantled by aircraft, many of them torpedo bombers once dismissed as obsolete. The TBF Avenger had not ended the battleship era alone. but it had become one of the instruments that proved battleships could no longer dominate the sea. The decisive weapon had shifted upward, into the air and into systems capable of sustained attack. This realization came too late to influence Japan's war effort. By 1945, the industrial gap was unbridgeable. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft production faltered. Training pipelines collapsed. There was no capacity left to adapt meaningfully. The Avenger symbolized everything Japan could not counter. It represented endurance over elegance, coordination over individual brilliance, replacement over preservation. It did not require perfect conditions, only sufficient ones, repeated often enough. Yamato's destruction marked more than the loss of a ship. It marked the collapse of a worldview that had guided Japanese naval strategy since before the First World War. The belief in a single, decisive clash between surface fleets died with her. What replaced it was a harsh truth. Wars at sea were now decided by systems, industrial, logistical, and operational, not by the size of guns or the thickness of armor. The Avenger was not glamorous. It did not inspire awe the way Yamato once had. But it survived, it returned, and it struck again. In that sense, Yamato's final battle was not a tragedy of defeat. It was a demonstration of inevitability. The aircraft Japanese officers once laughed at had helped make the greatest battleship in history irrelevant. And with that realization, the Imperial Japanese Navy reached the end of its strategic road. After the loss of Yamato, the question inside the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer what had gone wrong, but why nothing could be fixed. By 1945, the failures were obvious. The inability to stop American air power was undeniable. Yet adaptation, real adaptation, never came. The reasons ran deeper than technology. They were structural, cultural, and irreversible. Japan did not lose the air war because it failed to recognize danger. It lost because recognition arrived in a system incapable of change. At the heart of the problem was time. Effective adaptation requires margin, time to redesign aircraft, retrain pilots, retool factories, and rewrite doctrine. Japan had none of these. By the time the Avenger revealed its full potential, Japan was already operating at the edge of exhaustion. Fuel shortages crippled training. New pilots arrived at the front with minimal flight hours, sometimes barely qualified to land on carriers. Complex interception tactics, once second nature to veteran aviators, became impossible to execute consistently. Even when Japanese commanders understood what needed to be done, they lacked the means to do it. The Avenger exploited this weakness relentlessly. Its threat could not be countered by a single improvement. Faster fighters alone were not enough. Stronger anti-aircraft guns alone were not enough. Better tactics alone were not enough. Stopping the Avenger required a fully integrated system. Early detection, coordinated fighter control, layered defense, and sustained replacement capacity. That system no longer existed for Japan. Industrial limitations made the problem worse. Japan could not mass-produce heavily armored aircraft without sacrificing performance it could no longer afford to lose. Engines grew weaker as materials quality declined. Electronics lagged behind. Radar coverage remained limited and fragmented. Meanwhile, every Avenger sortie represented the opposite reality. American industry absorbed losses without slowing. Aircraft production increased even as quality improved. Crews were trained, rotated, and standardized. Tactical lessons were shared across the fleet. Japan was fighting a war of preservation. America was fighting a war of renewal. Doctrine also played a critical role. Japanese military culture prized continuity and hierarchy. Radical changes required consensus, and consensus took time. Proposing that pre-war doctrine had been fundamentally flawed was not just difficult, it was politically dangerous. Admitting that survivability mattered more than agility meant admitting that earlier design choices had been wrong. Admitting that systems mattered more than elite pilots meant admitting that the warrior ethos alone was insufficient. These were not easy concessions in a culture built on honor and precedent. The Avenger forced those questions, but Japan could not answer them fast enough. Even when adjustments were attempted, they came too late. Defensive tactics were revised, anti-aircraft fire was intensified. Desperate measures like kamikaze attacks emerged as substitutes for systemic solutions. These choices reflected desperation, not adaptation. The Avenger did not cause Japan's collapse, but it exposed the limits of Japan's ability to respond to change. American doctrine assumed that weapons would fail. pilots would die, and plans would collapse, and that all of this could be compensated for by scale, learning, and time. Japanese doctrine assumed that excellence would prevent collapse in the first place. That assumption had once produced stunning victories. Against an opponent like the United States, it proved fatal. By 1945, Japan faced an enemy that could absorb losses indefinitely while growing stronger. The Avenger was a visible symbol of that reality, an aircraft that returned damaged, repaired, and flew again, embodying a system that refused to break. Japan had no equivalent answer. The inability to adapt was not a failure of courage or intelligence. It was the consequence of a strategic framework built for short wars, limited losses, and decisive moments, none of which defined the conflict that followed. When Japanese officers finally understood what the Avenger represented, the war was already lost. The system it belonged to had outgrown anything Japan could counter. And yet, one final irony remained. The Avenger never sought recognition. It did not dominate headlines. It did not inspire legends. Its role was quieter and more devastating. That quiet dominance would become clear only in retrospect. When the war ended, few people spoke of the TBF Avenger with the reverence reserved for fighters or battleships. It did not define an era through speed records or iconic dogfights. It did not carry the mystique of the Zero or the terror of the B-29. And yet, when historians later traced the slow collapse of Japanese sea power, the Avenger appeared again and again at critical moments. Its dominance had been quiet, almost invisible in the shadow of more dramatic weapons. The Avenger did not arrive as a breakthrough. It became decisive through repetition. Mission after mission, it flew into contested airspace, released its payload, and, more often than expected, returned. In doing so, it accumulated influence rather than glory. By the final year of the war, the Avenger had become the most effective torpedo bomber the U.S. Navy ever operated. It sank more enemy ships than any other Allied aircraft type. That achievement was not the result of a single innovation, but of alignment between design, doctrine, and industrial capacity. The Avenger fit perfectly into the American way of war. It was forgiving to fly, allowing less experienced pilots to operate effectively. It protected its crews well enough that experience could accumulate rather than be constantly lost. And it could be adapted to multiple roles: torpedo attack, level bombing, reconnaissance, and anti-submarine warfare. This flexibility multiplied its impact. While Japanese planners focused on headline threats, the Avenger worked steadily in the background. It strangled supply lines. It harassed convoys. It forced Japanese ships to operate under constant threat, even far from major fleet actions. The Avenger's range made escape increasingly difficult. Its endurance allowed it to loiter, to wait, to return when opportunities emerged. Ships that might have avoided one strike often could not avoid the next. This persistence reshaped Japanese behavior at sea. Convoys sailed with heavier escorts, slowing movement and consuming scarce fuel. Capital ships limited sorties, conserving strength that would never be effectively used. Damage control crews operated under chronic strain, repairing wounds that never fully healed. The Avenger did not need to sink everything. It only needed to ensure that nothing operated freely. By comparison, Japanese aircraft struggled to maintain relevance. Replacement models arrived too late. Tactical innovations were reactive rather than proactive. The initiative remained firmly in American hands. The Avenger symbolized this imbalance. It was not the fastest, but it did not need to be. It was not the most advanced, but it did not need radical innovation. It functioned within a system that rewarded reliability and punished fragility. Even after Japan recognized the threat, there was no way to reverse the damage already done. Industrial output could not be expanded. Training pipelines could not be rebuilt. Fuel shortages worsened. The Avenger continued to fly. Its crews refined their methods. They shared lessons across squadrons. They operated with growing confidence, knowing that even if individual missions failed, the overall pressure would continue. In contrast, Japanese forces operated under a sense of finality. Every loss felt permanent. Every failure narrowed options. There was no space left for experimentation or recovery. This asymmetry defined the closing phase of the Pacific War. The Avenger was not a symbol of American brilliance. It was a symbol of American persistence. It represented a belief that wars are won not by perfect weapons, but by weapons that keep functioning under imperfect conditions. In that sense, its greatest strength was also its greatest obscurity. The Avenger did not dominate memory because it did not seek to. It simply did its job, day after day, mission after mission, until there was nothing left for it to sink. By the time peace arrived, the aircraft that had once been dismissed as slow and ungainly had quietly reshaped naval warfare. Not through spectacle, but through inevitability. Only one task remained: to understand what that inevitability ultimately meant. When the Pacific War finally ended, there was no single moment when Japanese officers collectively acknowledged their early mistake. There was no formal admission, no document stating that the TBF Avenger had been underestimated. History rarely offers such clarity. Instead, the realization emerged slowly through the silence left behind. By 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy no longer possessed the means to fight as it once had. Its carriers were gone. Its battleships lay at the bottom of the sea. Its air arm had been hollowed out by attrition. What remained were fragments of a force built for a kind of war that no longer existed. Only in retrospect did the pattern become unmistakable. The Avenger had not won the war by itself, but it had played a decisive role in dismantling the assumptions that once sustained Japanese naval power. It challenged the belief that speed guaranteed survival. It undermined the idea that elite skill could compensate for systemic weakness, and it exposed the vulnerability of ships designed to dominate a battlefield that no longer mattered. Japanese planners had evaluated the Avenger in 1942 using the wrong criteria. They had asked whether it could win a duel, whether it could evade fighters, whether it matched their own aircraft in agility and performance. By those measures, it seemed inferior. They did not ask whether it could return. They did not ask whether it could be repaired quickly, whether it could be flown by crews trained in months rather than years, whether it could be integrated into a system that grew stronger through loss rather than weaker. Those questions defined the outcome of the war. The Avenger belonged to a military culture that assumed failure and planned around it. Its designers accepted damage as inevitable and built the aircraft to endure it. Its operators treated losses as data, not disgrace. Each mission refined the next. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built on a different foundation, one that prized perfection, honor, and decisive moments. Against opponents who fought by those same rules, that foundation had once been formidable. Against an industrial power willing to absorb and learn from failure, it became a liability. By the time Japanese officers truly understood this difference, it was too late to matter. The Avenger continued flying even as the war closed. It escorted convoys, hunted submarines, and enforced the new reality of American dominance at sea. It transitioned seamlessly into peacetime service, its usefulness undiminished by the absence of glory. History would remember the Pacific War for its iconic weapons: the Zero, the Yamato, the B-29. The Avenger rarely appeared in those narratives, yet its impact was woven into nearly every decisive naval action of the later war. It did not need to be admired. It did not need to be feared in isolation. It only needed to be present again and again until resistance collapsed. The tragedy for Japan was not that it faced such an aircraft. It was that it failed to recognize what the aircraft represented. The Avenger was not merely a torpedo bomber. It was the embodiment of a system that could not be defeated by brilliance alone. In the end, the Imperial Japanese Navy did not lose because it lacked courage or skill. It lost because it fought the wrong kind of war, with the wrong assumptions, against an enemy prepared to fight longer than anyone imagined. The Avenger made that truth unavoidable. By the time Japanese officers finally understood why they had laughed in 1942, the war was already over, and the sea they once dominated belonged to someone else.